This is a continuation of The Hour of the Dragon, also known as Conan the Conqueror, by Robert E. Howard, comprising parts 8 and 9. Part 8, Dying Embers. The countryside about Tarantia had escaped the fearful ravaging of the more easterly provinces. There were evidences of the march of a conquering army and broken hedges, plundered fields and looted granaries. But torch and steel had not been loosed wholesale. There was but one grim splotch on the landscape, a charred expanse of ashes and blackened stone, where, Conan knew, had once stood the stately villa of one of his staunchest supporters. The king dared not openly approach the Galanis farm, which lay only a few miles from the city. In the twilight, he rode through an extensive woodland until he sighted a keeper's lodge through the trees. Dismounting and tying his horse, he approached the thick arched door with the intention of sending the keeper after Servius. He did not know what enemies the manor house might be sheltering. He had seen no troops, but they might be quartered all over the countryside. But as he drew near, he saw the door open, and a compact figure in silk hose and richly embroidered doublet stride forth and turn up a path that wound away through the woods. Servius! At the low call, the master of the plantation wheeled with a startled exclamation. His hand flew to the short hunting sword at his hip, and he recoiled from the tall gray steel figure standing in the dusk before him. "Who are you?" he demanded. "What is your mitra?" His breath hissed inward and his ruddy face paled. "Avaunt!" he ejaculated. "Why have you come back from the gray lands of death to terrify me? I was always your true liegeman in your lifetime." "As I still expect you to be," answered Conan. "Stop trembling, man. I'm flesh and blood." Sweating with uncertainty, Servius approached and stared into the face of the mail-clad giant, and then, convinced of the reality of what he saw, he dropped to one knee and doffed his plumed cap. "Your Majesty! Truly, this is a miracle passing belief. The great bell in the citadel has tolled your dirge, days agone. Men said you died at Valkia, crushed under 1,000,000 tons of earth and broken granite." "It was another in my harness," grunted Conan. "But let us talk later, if there is such a thing as a joint of beef on your board." "Forgive me, my lord," cried Servius, springing to his feet. "The dust of travel is gray on your mail, and I keep you standing here without rest or sup. Mitra, I see well enough now that you are alive, but I swear, when I turned and saw you standing all gray and dim in the twilight, the marrow of my knees turned to water. It is an ill thing to meet a man you thought dead in the woodland at dusk." "Bid the keeper see to my steed which is tied behind yonder oak," requested Conan, and Servius nodded, drawing the king up the path. The patrician, recovering from his supernatural fright, had become extremely nervous. "I will send a servant from the manor," he said. "The keeper is in his lodge, but I dare not trust even my servants in these days. It is better that only I know of your presence." Approaching the great house that glimmered dimly through the trees, he turned aside into a little-used path that ran between close-set oaks whose intertwining branches formed a vault overhead, shutting out the dim light of the gathering dusk. Servius hurried on through the darkness without speaking, and with something resembling panic in his manner, and presently led Conan through a small side door into a narrow, dimly illuminated corridor. They traversed this in haste and silence, and Servius brought the king into a spacious chamber with a high, oak-beamed ceiling and richly paneled walls. Logs flamed in the wide fireplace, for there was a frosty edge to the air, and a great meat pasty in a stone platter stood smoking on a broad mahogany board. Servius locked the massive door and extinguished the candles that stood in a silver candlestick on the table, leaving the chamber illuminated only by the fire on the hearth. "Your pardon, your majesty," he apologized. "These are perilous times. Spies lurk everywhere. It were better that none be able to peer through the windows and recognize you. This pasty, however, is just from the oven, as I intended supping on my return from talk with my keeper. If your majesty would deign—" "The light is sufficient," grunted Conan, seating himself with scant ceremony and drawing his poniard. He dug ravenously into the luscious dish and washed it down with great gulps of wine from grapes grown in Servius's vineyards. He seemed oblivious to any sense of peril, but Servius shifted uneasily on his settle by the fire, nervously fingering the heavy gold chain about his neck. He glanced continually at the diamond panes of the casement, gleaming dimly in the firelight, and cocked his ear toward the door, as if half expecting to hear the pad of furtive feet in the corridor without. Finishing his meal, Conan rose and seated himself on another settle before the fire. "I won't jeopardize you long by my presence, Servius," he said abruptly. "Dawn will find me far from your plantation." "My lord?" Servius lifted his hands in expostulation, but Conan waved his protests aside. "I know your loyalty and your courage. Both are above reproach. But if Valerius has usurped my throne, it would be death for you to shelter me if you were discovered." "I am not strong enough to defy him openly," admitted Servius. "The 50 men at arms I could lead to battle would be but a handful of straws. You saw the ruins of Aemilius Scaevolus's plantation?" Conan nodded, frowning darkly. "He was the strongest patrician in this province, as you know. He refused to give his allegiance to Valerius. The Numidians burned him in the ruins of his own villa. After that, the rest of us saw the futility of resistance, especially as the people of Tarantia refused to fight. We submitted, and Valerius spared our lives, though he levied a tax upon us that will ruin many. But what could we do? We thought you were dead. Many of the barons had been slain, others taken prisoner. The army was shattered and scattered. You have no heir to take the crown. There was no one to lead us." "Was there not Count Trocero of Poitin?" demanded Conan harshly. Servius spread his hands helplessly. "It is true that his general Prospero was in the field with a small army. Retreating before Amalric, he urged men to rally to his banner. But, with your majesty dead, men remembered old wars and civil brawls, and how Trocero and his Poitanians once rode through these provinces even as Amalric was riding now, with torch and sword. The barons were jealous of Trocero. Some men, spies of Valerius perhaps, shouted that the Count of Poitin intended seizing the crown for himself. Old sectional hates flared up again. If we had had one man with dynastic blood in his veins, we would have crowned and followed him against Numidia. But we had none. The barons who followed you loyally would not follow one of their own number, each holding himself as good as his neighbor, each fearing the ambitions of the others. You were the cord that held the faggots together. When the cord was cut, the faggots fell apart. If you had had a son, the barons would have rallied loyally to him. But there was no point for their patriotism to focus upon. The merchants and commoners, dreading anarchy and a return of feudal days when each baron was his own law, cried out that any king was better than none, even Valerius, who was at least of the blood of the old dynasty. There was no one to oppose him when he rode up at the head of his steel-clad hosts, with the scarlet dragon of Numidia floating over him, and rang his lance against the gates of Tarantia. Nay, the people threw open the gates and knelt in the dust before him. They had refused to aid Prospero in holding the city. They said they had rather be ruled by Valerius than by Trocero. They said, truthfully, that the barons would not rally to Trocero, but that many would accept Valerius. They said that by yielding to Valerius, they would escape the devastation of civil war and the fury of the Numidians. Prospero rode southward with his 10,000 knights, and the horsemen of the Numidians entered the city a few hours later. They did not follow him. They remained to see that Valerius was crowned in Tarantia. "Then the old witch's smoke showed the truth," muttered Conan, feeling a queer chill along his spine. "Amalric crowned Valerius?" "Aye, in the coronation hall, with the blood of slaughter scarcely dried on his hands." "And do the people thrive under his benevolent rule?" asked Conan with angry irony. "He lives like a foreign prince in the midst of a conquered land," answered Servius bitterly. "His court is filled with Numidians, the palace troops are of the same breed, and a large garrison of them occupy the citadel. Aye, the hour of the dragon has come at last. Numidians swagger like lords through the streets, women are outraged and merchants plundered daily, and Valerius either can or will make no attempt to curb them. Nay, he is but their puppet, their figurehead. Men of sense knew he would be, and the people are beginning to find it out. Amalric has ridden forth with a strong army to reduce the outlying provinces where some of the barons have defied him. But there is no unity among them. Their jealousy of each other is stronger than their fear of Amalric. He will crush them one by one. Many castles and cities, realizing that, have sent in their submission. Those who resist fare miserably. The Numidians are glutting their long hatred, and their ranks are swelled by Aquilonians whom fear, gold, or necessity of occupation are forcing into their armies. It is a natural consequence." Conan nodded somberly, staring at the red reflections of the firelight on the richly carved oaken panels. Aquilonia has a king instead of the anarchy they feared, said Servius at last. Valerius does not protect his subjects against his allies. Hundreds who could not pay the ransom imposed upon them have been sold to the Kothic slave traders. Conan's head jerked up, and a lethal flame lit his blue eyes. He swore gustily, his mighty hands knotting into iron hammers. Aye, white men sell white men and white women, as it was in the feudal days. In the palaces of Shem and of Turan, they will live out the lives of slaves. Valerius is king, but the unity for which the people looked, even though of the sword, is not complete. Gunderland in the north and Poitain in the south are yet unconquered, and there are unsubdued provinces in the west, where the border barons have the backing of the Bessonian bowmen. Yet these outlying provinces are no real menace to Valerius. They must remain on the defensive, and will be lucky if they are able to keep their independence. Here, Valerius and his foreign knights are supreme. Let him make the best of it then, said Conan grimly. His time is short. The people will rise when they learn that I'm alive. We'll take Tarantia back before Amalric can return with his army. Then we'll sweep these dogs from the kingdom. Servius was silent. The crackle of the fire was loud in the stillness. Well, exclaimed Conan impatiently, why do you sit with your head bent, staring at the hearth? Do you doubt what I have said? Servius avoided the king's eye. What mortal man can do, you will do, your majesty, he answered. I have ridden behind you in battle, and I know that no mortal being can stand before your sword. What then? Servius drew his fur-trimmed jupon closer about him and shivered in spite of the flame. Men say your fall was occasioned by sorcery, he said presently. What then? What mortal can fight against sorcery? Who is this veiled man who communes at midnight with Valerius and his allies? As men say, who appears and disappears so mysteriously. Men say in whispers that he is a great magician who died thousands of years ago, but has returned from death's grey lands to overthrow the king of Aquilonia and restore the dynasty of which Valerius is heir. What matter? Exclaimed Conan angrily. I escaped from the devil-haunted pits of Belverus, and from diabolism in the mountains. If the people rise... Servius shook his head. Your staunchest supporters in the eastern and central provinces are dead, fled, or imprisoned. Gunderland is far to the north, Poitain far to the south. The Bessonians have retired to their marches far to the west. It would take weeks to gather and concentrate these forces, and before that could be done, each levy would be attacked separately by Amalric and destroyed. But an uprising in the central provinces would tip the scales for us, exclaimed Conan. We could seize Tarantia and hold it against Amalric until the Gundermen and Poitanians could get here. Servius hesitated, and his voice sank to a whisper. Men say you died accursed. Men say this veiled stranger cast a spell upon you to slay you and break your army. The great bell has tolled your dirge. Men believe you to be dead, and the central provinces would not rise, even if they knew you lived. They would not dare. Sorcery defeated you at Valkia. Sorcery brought the news to Tarantia, for that very night men were shouting of it in the streets. A Nemedian priest loosed black magic again in the streets of Tarantia to slay men who still were loyal to your memory. I myself saw it. Armed men dropped like flies and died in the streets in a manner no man could understand. And the lean priest laughed and said, I am only Altaro, only an acolyte of Orastes, who is but an acolyte of him who wears the veil. Not mine is the power but works through me. Well, said Conan harshly, is it not better to die honorably than to live in infamy? Is death worse than oppression, slavery, and ultimate destruction? When the fear of sorcery is in, reason is out, replied Servius. The fear of the central provinces is too great to allow them to rise for you. The outlying provinces would fight for you, but the same sorcery that smote your army at Valkia would smite you again. The Nemedians hold the broadest, richest, and most thickly populated sections of Aquilonia, and they cannot be defeated by the forces which might still be at your command. You would be sacrificing your loyal subjects uselessly. In sorrow I say it, but it is true. King Conan, you are a king without a kingdom. Conan stared into the fire without replying. A smoldering log crashed down among the flames without a bursting shower of sparks. It might have been the crashing ruin of his kingdom. Again Conan felt the presence of a grim reality behind the veil of material illusion. He sensed again the inexorable drive of a ruthless fate. A feeling of furious panic tugged at his soul, a sense of being trapped, and a red rage that burned to destroy and kill. "Where are the officials of my court?" he demanded at last. Pallantides was sorely wounded at Valkia, was ransomed by his family, and now lies in his castle in Attalus. He will be fortunate if he ever rides again. Publius, the chancellor, has fled the kingdom in disguise, no man knows whither. The council has been disbanded, some were imprisoned, some banished. Many of your loyal subjects have been put to death. Tonight, for instance, the Countess Albiona dies under the headsman's axe. Conan started and stared at Servius with such anger smoldering in his blue eyes that the patrician shrank back. Why? Because she would not become the mistress of Valerius. Her lands are forfeit, her henchmen sold into slavery, and at midnight, in the Iron Tower, her head must fall. Be advised, my king, to me you will ever be my king, and flee before you are discovered. In these days none is safe. Spies and informers creep among us, betraying the slightest deed or word of discontent as treason and rebellion. If you make yourself known to your subjects, it will only end in your capture and death. My horses and all the men that I can trust are at your disposal. Before dawn, we can be far from Tarantia and well on our way toward the border. If I cannot aid you to recover your kingdom, I can at least follow you into exile." Conan shook his head. Servius glanced uneasily at him as he sat staring into the fire, his chin propped on his mighty fist. The firelight gleamed redly on his steel mail, on his baleful eyes. They burned in the firelight like the eyes of a wolf. Servius was again aware, as in the past, and now more strongly than ever, of something alien about the king. That great frame under the mail mesh was too hard and supple for a civilized man. The elemental fire of the primitive burned in those smoldering eyes. Now the barbaric suggestion about the king was more pronounced, as if in his extremity the outward aspects of civilization were stripped away, to reveal the primordial core. Conan was reverting to his pristine type. He did not act as a civilized man would act under the same conditions, nor did his thoughts run in the same channels. He was unpredictable. It was only a stride from the king of Aquilonia to the skin-clad slayer of the Cimmerian hills. "I'll ride to Poitin, if it may be," Conan said at last, "but I'll ride alone, and I have one last duty to perform as king of Aquilonia." "What do you mean, your majesty?" asked Servius, shaken by a premonition. "I'm going into Tarantia after Albiona tonight," answered the king. "I've failed all my other loyal subjects, it seems. If they take her head, they can have mine too." "This is madness," cried Servius, staggering up and clutching his throat, as if he already felt the noose closing about it. "There are secrets to the tower which few know," said Conan. "Anyway, I'd be a dog to leave Albiona to die because of her loyalty to me. I may be a king without a kingdom, but I'm not a man without honor." "It will ruin us all," whispered Servius. "It will ruin no one but me if I fail. You've risked enough. I ride alone tonight. This is all I want you to do. Procure me a patch for my eye, a staff for my hand, and garments such as travelers wear." Part 9. It is the king or his ghost. Many men pass through the great arched gates of Tarantia between sunset and midnight. Belated travelers, merchants from afar with heavily laden mules, free workmen from the surrounding farms and vineyards. Now that Valerius was supreme in the central provinces, there was no rigid scrutiny of the folk who flowed in a steady stream through the wide gates. Discipline had been relaxed. The Nemedian soldiers who stood on guard were half drunk, and much too busy watching for handsome peasant girls and rich merchants who could be bullied to notice workmen or dusty travelers, even one tall wayfarer whose worn cloak could not conceal the hard lines of his powerful frame. This man carried himself with an erect, aggressive bearing that was too natural for him to realize it himself, much less dissemble it. A great patch covered one eye, and his leather coif, drawn low over his brows, shadowed his features. With a long, thick staff in his muscular brown hand, he strode leisurely through the arch where the torches flared and guttered, and, ignored by the tipsy guardsmen, emerged upon the wide streets of Tarantia. Upon these well-lighted thoroughfares, the usual throngs went about their business, and shops and stalls stood open, with their wares displayed. One thread ran a constant theme through the pattern. Nemedian soldiers, singly or in clumps, swaggered through the throngs, shouldering their way with studied arrogance. Women scurried from their path, and men stepped aside with darkened brows and clenched fists. The Aquilonians were a proud race, and these were their hereditary enemies. The knuckles of the tall traveler nodded on his staff, but, like the others, he stepped aside to let the men in armor have the way. Among the motley and varied crowd, he did not attract much attention in his drab, dusty garments. But once, as he passed a sword seller's stall, and the light that streamed from its wide door fell full upon him, he thought he felt an intense stare upon him, and turning quickly, saw a man in the brown jerkin of a free workman regarding him fixedly. This man turned away with undue haste, and vanished in the shifting throng, but Conan turned into a narrow by-street and quickened his pace. It might have been mere idle curiosity, but he could take no chances. The grim iron tower stood apart from the citadel, amid a maze of narrow streets and crowding houses where the meaner structures, appropriating a space from which the more fastidious shrank, had invaded a portion of the city ordinarily alien to them. The tower was in reality a castle, an ancient, formidable pile of heavy stone and black iron which had itself served as the citadel in an earlier, ruder century. Not a long distance from it, lost in a tangle of partly deserted tenements and warehouses, stood an ancient watchtower, so old and forgotten that it did not appear on the maps of the city for 100 years back. Its original purpose had been forgotten, and nobody, of such as saw it at all, noticed that the apparently ancient lock which kept it from being appropriated as sleeping quarters by beggars and thieves was in reality comparatively new and extremely powerful, cunningly disguised into an appearance of rusty antiquity. Not half a dozen men in the kingdom had ever known the secret of that tower. No keyhole showed in the massive green-crusted lock, but Conan's practiced fingers, stealing over it, pressed here and there knobs invisible to the casual eye. The door silently opened inward, and he entered solid blackness, pushing the door shut behind him. A light would have showed the tower empty, a bare, cylindrical shaft of massive stone. Groping in a corner with the sureness of familiarity, he found the projections for which he was feeling on a slab of the stone that composed the floor. Quickly he lifted it, and without hesitation, lowered himself into the aperture beneath. His feet felt stone steps leading downward into what he knew was a narrow tunnel that ran straight toward the foundations of the iron tower, 3 streets away. The bell on the citadel, which tolled only at the midnight hour or for the death of a king, boomed suddenly. In a dimly lighted chamber in the iron tower, a door opened and a form emerged into a corridor. The interior of the tower was as forbidding as its external appearance. Its massive stone walls were rough, unadorned. The flags of the floor were worn deep by generations of faltering feet, and the vault of the ceiling was gloomy in the dim light of torches set in niches. The man who trudged down that grim corridor was in appearance in keeping with his surroundings. He was a tall, powerfully built man, clad in close-fitting black silk. Over his head was drawn a black hood, which fell about his shoulders, having 2 holes for his eyes. From his shoulders hung a loose black cloak, and over one shoulder he bore a heavy axe, the shape of which was that of neither tool nor weapon. As he went down the corridor, a figure came hobbling up it, a bent, surly old man, stooping under the weight of his pike and a lantern he bore in one hand. "You are not as prompt as your predecessor, Master Headsman," he grumbled. "Midnight has just struck, and masked men have gone to Milady's cell. They await you." "The tones of the bells still echo among the towers," answered the executioner. "If I am not so quick to leap and run at the beck of Aquilonians, as was the dog who held this office before me, they shall find my arm no less ready. Get you to your duties, old watchman, and leave me to mine. I think mine is the sweeter trade, by Mitra, for you tramp cold corridors and peer at rusty dungeon doors, while I lop off the fairest head in Tarantia this night." The watchman limped on down the corridor, still grumbling, and the headsman resumed his leisurely way. A few strides carried him around a turn in the corridor, and he absently noted that at his left a door stood partly open. If he had thought, he would have known that that door had been opened since the watchman passed, but thinking was not his trade. He was passing the unlocked door before he realized that aught was amiss, and then it was too late. A soft, tigerish step and the rustle of a cloak warned him, but before he could turn, a heavy arm hooked about his throat from behind, crushing the cry before it could reach his lips. In the brief instant that was allowed him, he realized with a surge of panic the strength of his attacker, against which his own brawny thews were helpless. He sensed without seeing the poised dagger. "Nemedian dog," muttered a voice thick with passion in his ear. "You've cut off your last Aquilonian head." And that was the last thing he ever heard. In a dank dungeon, lighted only by a guttering torch, 3 men stood about a young woman who knelt on the rush-strewn flags, staring wildly up at them. She was clad only in a scanty shift. Her golden hair fell in lustrous ripples about her white shoulders, and her wrists were bound behind her. Even in the uncertain torchlight, and in spite of her disheveled condition and pallor of fear, her beauty was striking. She knelt mutely, staring with wide eyes up at her tormentors. The men were closely masked and cloaked. Such a deed as this needed masks, even in a conquered land. She knew them all nevertheless, but what she knew would harm no one after that night. "Our merciful sovereign offers you one more chance, Countess," said the tallest of the 3, and he spoke Aquilonian without an accent. "He bids me say that if you soften your proud, rebellious spirit, he will still open his arms to you. If not—" He gestured toward a grim wooden block in the center of the cell. It was blackly stained and showed many deep nicks as if a keen edge, cutting through some yielding substance, had sunk into the wood. Albiona shuddered and turned pale, shrinking back. Every fiber in her vigorous young body quivered with the urge of life. Valerius was young too, and handsome. Many women loved him, she told herself, fighting with herself for life. But she could not speak the word that would ransom her soft young body from the block and the dripping axe. She could not reason the matter. She only knew that, when she thought of the clasp of Valerius's arms, her flesh crawled with an abhorrence greater than the fear of death. She shook her head helplessly, compelled by an impulsion more irresistible than the instinct to live. "Then there is no more to be said," exclaimed one of the others impatiently, and he spoke with a Nemedian accent. "Where is the headsman?" As if summoned by the word, the dungeon door opened silently, and a great figure stood framed in it, like a black shadow from the underworld. Albiona voiced a low, involuntary cry at the sight of that grim shape, and the others stared silently for a moment, perhaps themselves daunted with superstitious awe at the silent, hooded figure. Through the coif, the eyes blazed like coals of blue fire, and as these eyes rested on each man in turn, he felt a curious chill travel down his spine. Then the tall Aquilonian roughly seized the girl and dragged her to the block. She screamed uncontrollably and fought hopelessly against him, frantic with terror, but he ruthlessly forced her to her knees and bent her yellow head down to the bloody block. "Why do you delay, headsman?" he exclaimed angrily. "Perform your task." He was answered by a short, gusty boom of laughter that was indescribably menacing. All in the dungeon froze in their places, staring at the hooded shape, the 2 cloaked figures, the masked man bending over the girl herself on her knees, twisting her imprisoned head to look upward. "What means this unseemly mirth, dog?" demanded the Aquilonian uneasily. The man in the black garb tore his hood from his head and flung it to the ground. He set his back to the closed door and lifted the headsman's axe. "Do you know me, dogs?" he rumbled. "Do you know me?" The breathless silence was broken by a scream. "The king!" shrieked Albiona, wrenching herself free from the slackened grasp of her captor. "Oh, Mitra, the king!" The 3 men stood like statues, and then the Aquilonian started and spoke, like a man who doubts his own senses. "Conan!" he ejaculated. "It is the king or his ghost. What devil's work is this?" "Devil's work to match devils," mocked Conan, his lips laughing but hell flaming in his eyes. "Come, fall to, my gentlemen. You have your swords, and I this cleaver. Nay, I think this butcher's tool fits the work at hand, my fair lords." "At him," muttered the Aquilonian, drawing his sword. "It is Conan, and we must kill or be killed." And like men waking from a trance, the Nemedians drew their blades and rushed on the king. The headsman's axe was not made for such work, but the king wielded the heavy, clumsy weapon as lightly as a hatchet, and his quickness of foot, as he constantly shifted his position, defeated their purpose of engaging him all 3 at once. He caught the sword of the first man on his axe head and crushed in the wielder's breast with a murderous counterstroke before he could step back or parry. The remaining Nemedian, missing a savage swipe, had his brains dashed out before he could recover his balance, and an instant later, the Aquilonian was backed into a corner, desperately parrying the crashing strokes that rained about him, lacking opportunity even to scream for help. Suddenly, Conan's long left arm shot out and ripped the mask from the man's head, disclosing the pallid features. "Dog!" grated the king. "I thought I knew you. Traitor, damned renegade. Even this base steel is too honorable for your foul head. Nay, die as thieves die." The axe fell in a devastating arch, and the Aquilonian cried out and went to his knees, grasping the severed stump of his right arm, from which blood spouted. It had been shorn away at the elbow, and the axe, unchecked in its descent, had gashed deeply into his side so that his entrails bulged out. "Lie there and bleed to death," grunted Conan, casting the axe away disgustedly. "Come, Countess." Stooping, he slashed the cords that bound her wrists, and lifting her as if she had been a child, strode from the dungeon. She was sobbing hysterically, with her arms thrown about his corded neck in a frenzied embrace. "Easy all," he muttered. "We're not out of this yet. If we can reach the dungeon where the secret door opens on stairs that lead to the tunnel, devil take it, they've heard that noise, even through these walls." Down the corridor arms clanged and the tramp and shouting of men echoed under the vaulted roof. A bent figure came hobbling swiftly along, lantern held high, and its light shone full on Conan and the girl. With a curse, the Cimmerian sprang toward him, but the old watchman, abandoning both lantern and pike, scuttled away down the corridor, screeching for help at the top of his cracked voice. Deeper shouts answered him. Conan turned swiftly and ran the other way. He was cut off from the dungeon, with the secret lock and the hidden door through which he had entered the tower, and by which he had hoped to leave, but he knew this grim building well. Before he was king, he had been imprisoned in it. He turned off into a side passage and quickly emerged into another, broader corridor, which ran parallel to the one down which he had come, and which was at the moment deserted. He followed this only a few yards when he again turned back, down another side passage. This brought him back into the corridor he had left, but at a strategic point. A few feet farther up the corridor, there was a heavy bolted door, and before it stood a bearded Nemedian in corselet and helmet, his back to Conan as he peered up the corridor in the direction of the growing tumult and wildly waving lanterns. Conan did not hesitate. Slipping the girl to the ground, he ran at the guard swiftly and silently, sword in hand. The man turned just as the king reached him, bawled in surprise and fright, and lifted his pike. But before he could bring the clumsy weapon into play, Conan brought down his sword on the fellow's helmet with a force that would have felled an ox. Helmet and skull gave way together, and the guard crumpled to the floor. In an instant, Conan had drawn the massive bolt that barred the door, too heavy for one ordinary man to have manipulated, and called hastily to Albiona, who ran staggering to him. Catching her up unceremoniously with one arm, he bore her through the door and into the outer darkness. They had come into a narrow alley, black as pitch, walled by the side of the tower on one hand, and the sheer stone back of a row of buildings on the other. Conan, hurrying through the darkness as swiftly as he dared, felt the latter wall for doors or windows, but found none. The great door clanged open behind them, and men poured out, with torches gleaming on breastplates and naked swords. They glared about, bellowing, unable to penetrate the darkness which their torches served to illuminate for only a few feet in any direction, and then rushed down the alley at random, heading in the direction opposite to that taken by Conan and Albiona. "They'll learn their mistake quick enough," he muttered, increasing his pace. "If we ever find a crack in this infernal wall, damn, the street watch!" Ahead of them, a faint glow became apparent, where the alley opened into a narrow street, and he saw dim figures looming against it with a glimmer of steel. It was indeed the street watch, investigating the noise they had heard echoing down the alley. "Who goes there?" they shouted, and Conan grit his teeth at the hated Nemedian accent. "Keep behind me," he ordered the girl. "We've got to cut our way through before the prison guards come back and pin us between them." And grasping his sword, he ran straight at the oncoming figures. The advantage of surprise was his. He could see them, limned against the distant glow, and they could not see him coming at them out of the black depths of the alley. He was among them before they knew it, smiting with the silent fury of a wounded lion. His one chance lay in hacking through before they could gather their wits. But there were half a score of them, in full mail, hard-bitten veterans of the border wars, in whom the instinct for battle could take the place of bemused wits. 3 of them were down before they realized that it was only one man who was attacking them, but even so, their reaction was instantaneous. The clangor of steel rose deafeningly, and sparks flew as Conan's sword crashed on bassinet and hauberk. He could see better than they, and in the dim light, his swiftly moving figure was an uncertain mark. Flailing swords cut empty air, or glanced from his blade, and when he struck, it was with the fury and certainty of a hurricane. But behind him sounded the shouts of the prison guards, returning up the alley at a run, and still the mailed figures before him barred his way with a bristling wall of steel. In an instant, the guards would be on his back. In desperation, he redoubled his strokes, flailing like a smith on an anvil, and then was suddenly aware of a diversion. Out of nowhere behind the watchman rose a score of black figures, and there was a sound of blows, murderously driven. Steel glinted in the gloom, and men cried out, struck mortally from behind. In an instant, the alley was littered with writhing forms. A dark cloaked shape sprang toward Conan, who heaved up his sword, catching a gleam of steel in the right hand. But the other was extended to him empty, and a voice hissed urgently, "This way, your majesty! Quickly!" With a muttered oath of surprise, Conan caught up Albiona in one massive arm and followed his unknown befriender. He was not inclined to hesitate, with 30 prison guardsmen closing in behind him. Surrounded by mysterious figures, he hurried down the alley, carrying the Countess as if she had been a child. He could tell nothing of his rescuers, except that they wore dark cloaks and hoods. Doubt and suspicion crossed his mind, but at least they had struck down his enemies, and he saw no better course than to follow them. As if sensing his doubt, the leader touched his arm lightly and said, "Fear not, King Conan, we are your loyal subjects." The voice was not familiar, but the accent was Aquilonian of the central provinces. Behind them, the guards were yelling as they stumbled over the shambles in the mud, and they came pelting vengefully down the alley, seeing the vague dark mass moving between them and the light of the distant street. But the hooded men turned suddenly toward the seemingly blank wall, and Conan saw a door gape there. He muttered a curse. He had traversed that alley by day, in times past, and had never noticed a door there. But through it they went, and the door closed behind them with the click of a lock. The sound was not reassuring, but his guides were hurrying him on, moving with the precision of familiarity, guiding Conan with a hand at either elbow. It was like traversing a tunnel, and Conan felt Albiona's lithe limbs trembling in his arms. Then, somewhere ahead of them, an opening was faintly visible, merely a somewhat less black arch in the blackness, and through this they filed. After that, there was a bewildering succession of dim courts and shadowy alleys and winding corridors, all traversed in utter silence, until at last they emerged into a broad lighted chamber, the location of which Conan could not even guess, for their devious route had confused even his primitive sense of direction. This concludes the 5th part of 12 total of The Hour of the Dragon, also known as Conan the Conqueror, by Robert E. Howard, produced by Best Audiobooks for free.